The concept of universalizability was set out by the 18th-century German philosopher Immanuel Kant as part of his groundwork of the metaphysic of morals. It is part of the first formulation of his categorical imperative, which states that the only morally acceptable maxims of our actions are those that could rationally be willed to be universal law. The precise meaning of universalizability is contentious, but the most common interpretation is that the categorical imperative asks whether the maxim of your action could become one that everyone could act upon in similar circumstances. An action is morally acceptable if it can be universalized, that is, everyone could do it. For instance, one can determine whether a maxim of lying to secure a loan is moral by attempting to universalize it and applying reason to the results. If everyone lied to secure loans, the very practices of promising and lending would fall apart, and the maxim would then become impossible. Kant calls such acts examples of a contradiction in conception, which is much like a performative contradiction, because they undermine the very basis for their existence. Kant's notion of universalizability has a clear antecedent in Rousseau's idea of a general will. Both notions provide for a radical separation of will and nature, leading to the idea that true freedom lies substantially in self-legislation.
What does it mean to universalize the maxim about borrowing money without intending to return it? It is simple. Imagine a hypothetical world in which each person, whenever she is in need of money, is obligated to borrow from another even when she knows she cannot pay it back. We do not imagine that people actually borrowed money without intending to return it. Instead, we think of them as obligated to do so. Now, there are two possibilities in this hypothetical world where people are obligated to borrow money without intending to pay it. The maxim can be either make sense or not make sense as a universal law. By making sense, we refer to the logical plausibility of the universalized maxim. The opposite of the logical plausibility is self-contradiction or logical impossibility. What would happen to the status of the universalized maxim? The purpose of borrowing money would be defeated because no one will lend money. In a world where it is an obligation to borrow money without paying back, all lenders would know that they will not be paid and they will refuse to lend money. The institution of money borrowing would lose its meaning if everyone has obligated to borrow money without intending to pay it back. As a universalized maxim, it would self-destruct because it become impossible. When I am in need of money, I shall borrow it even when I know I cannot pay it back. The meaning of this act is to borrow. It implies taking and using something with the intent to return it, even when I know I cannot pay it back. This is which contradicts the very meaning of to borrow. The contradiction is evident. To borrow implies returning, but the intention is not to return. What is the result of all this? We reveal the rational permissibility of actions insofar as they cannot be rejected as universal maxim. In contrast, those universalized maxims that are rejected are shown to be impermissible. That is, they are irrational and thus Kant's mind immoral. But what does rational permissibility mean? It is easy to prove that if the notions of a belief's being justified or rational are normative at all, then the permissibility of a belief is sufficient for the belief's being justified or rational. It refers to the intrinsic quality of an action that it is objectively and necessarily not rational. Using the universality test, we can reveal the objective necessity of an action as rational. For example, the quality of the arithmetical claim 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. It is objectively necessary because the quality of the claim is universally or logically valid. And we understand this to be always true as rational beings. Observe the difference between the quality of objectively necessary claims, which contingent claims, such as claims about the world like the sky is blue, the truth of which depends on the actual situation in the world. Therefore, we have demonstrated that borrowing money without intending to pay, as a kind of false promise, is objectively and necessarily wrong, insofar as it encounters a self-contradiction and logical impossibility when it is universalized as a maxim.
What is virtue ethics? Virtue ethics is one of the major approaches in normative ethics. It is viewed as an approach to ethics that emphasizes the person's trait or character in moral thinking. Hence, trait or character is central to virtue ethics, in contrast to the other approaches that emphasizes the consequences of an action, as in the case of consequentialism, or the rules or duties, as in the case of deontological ethics. Therefore, what makes virtue ethics distinct from deontology and consequentialism is that it does not provide the moral agent with specific principles or rules to guide her actions. That is why, in Aristotelian ethics, with which most virtue ethics theorists drew inspiration, practical wisdom is a central category that helps individuals become virtuous. For this reason, virtue ethics deals with broader questions like, what kind of life should I live? What is a good life? And how can I be consistent in my moral actions? Instead of questions like, what ought I do? As in the case of deontology, or will my actions produce greater happiness to the greater number of people in society? As in the case of consequentialism. As we can see, virtue ethics in general does not particularly deal with the rightness or wrongness of specific actions. Rather, with the aid of practical wisdom, virtue ethics guides the moral agent in seeking the good. There are three major forms of virtue ethics taken by contemporary theorists, namely, ethics of care, agent-based theories, and eudaimonist virtue ethics. The nature and dynamics of virtue ethics can be properly understood through these three main forms. And so, let me briefly explain each. First, the proponents of the ethics of care hold the idea that a moral action centers on social and environmental relationships, in which care or kindness is considered as the main virtue. It suggests that care is a central category in determining the moral worth of human actions. Michael Sloat, a famous ethics professor at the University of Miami, corroborates this point by stating that caring is the primary virtue, and that a morality based on the motive of caring can offer a general account of right and wrong action. Hence, the motive in developing man's moral practices, in which care is the primary virtue, is clearly the main objective of the ethics of care. The ethics of care, therefore, examines moral practices and values, which focuses on moral development. This is made possible through the reformation of practices rather than the use of reason. This notion of reformation of practices, which is to be nurtured and developed into a virtue, is the primary concern of the ethics of care.
Agent-based theories, on the other hand, are unitary normative theories. This form of virtue ethics views the status of actions as entirely dependent upon the moral status of an agent's motives and character. As Sloat writes, a warm, agent-based virtue ethics puts a fundamental emphasis on a person's motives and more particularly on a person's overall morally relevant motivation. Say, for example, an act is morally acceptable if and only if it comes from good or virtuous motivation involving benevolence or caring about the well-being of others, or at least doesn't come from bad or inferior motivation involving malice or indifference to humanity. Thus again, in agent-based theory, an action is right if it expresses a virtuous motive or at least does not exhibit a malicious intention from the agent. Third and last is the eudaimonist virtue ethics. Eudaimonism comes from the Greek word eudaimonia, which can be translated as happiness, well-being, or the good life. For Aristotle, happiness, or the good life, is the highest goal of man, which can be achieved by a lifetime of actively exercising moral virtues, or arete. And according to Aristotle, to enhance moral virtue, we need phronesis or practical wisdom, which can resolve any concurrent ethical problem. Indeed, with moral virtue, human life would attain eudaimonia, the happiness which should be seen as a final end, and not as a subjective state characterized by the seemingly well-lived life irrespective of the emotional state of the person experiencing it. As we can see, eudaimonist virtue ethics aims for eternal goodness rather than depending on the contingent recurrence of certain actions. It emphasizes the entire development of a moral person, that is, to become holistically good as she reaches the point of ultimate end.
Want to become a virtuous person? Virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is part of normative ethics. Its founding father is Aristotle. Virtue ethics emphasizes the role of character and virtue rather than either doing one's duty or acting in order to bring about good consequences. A virtue ethicist would likely give you the moral advice: act as a virtuous person would act in your situations. Virtue ethics theories deal with questions such as how should I live? What is the good life? And what are proper family and social values? Virtue is a character trait, that is, a disposition which is well entrenched in its possessor, something that goes all the way down. Hence, a virtue such as kindness or generosity is not just a tendency to do what is kind or generous, nor is it to be helpful specified as a desirable or morally valuable character trait. It is concerned with many other actions as well, with emotions and emotional reactions, choices, values, desires, perceptions, attitudes, interests, expectations, and sensibilities. For example, an honest person cannot be identified simply as one who practices honest dealing and does not cheat. If such actions are done merely because the agent thinks that honesty is the best policy, or because they fear being caught out, rather than through recognizing to do otherwise would be dishonest as a relevant reason, they are not the actions of an honest person. labels that would be a lie as a strong reason for not making certain statements in certain circumstances and gives due weight to that would be the truth as a reason for making them. However, every virtue can easily become a fault if not correctly applied. For instance, someone's compassion might lead them to act wrongly, to tell a lie they should not have told, for example, in their desire to prevent someone else's hurt feelings. For Aristotle, being virtuous meant avoiding this kind of extreme by following the path between two vices, that of not applying a virtue enough and that of applying it too much. He called this finding the mean of a virtue. For example, courage is the mean between cowardliness and recklessness. This is where practical wisdom comes in. Practical wisdom involves the understanding of what is required in a particular situation in light of a general understanding of what is good. One must not only understand the situation, which can involve considering